Back in 2001, Gary Collins published his seminal work, really, called Christian Coaching. And one of the huge contributors was, of course, Chris McCluskey. And in there, there's an interview between Gary and Chris, where Chris talks about his worship, work, and play model of life balance. So let's go ahead and start unpacking it. So before you even dive right into the model, what is the basic premise of your model, and what are you hoping it'll do for our listeners and those who understand it better?
Sure. The basic premise is that in the Christian faith, we have many encouragements to the idea that the whole purpose of our life is ultimately to glorify God. We have the Westminster Catechism. The portion that persons are most familiar with is the chief end of man is to glorify God. There it is in a nutshell. Boy, as soon as I hear the first part of that, the chief end of man is, it's like, wait, stop everything else. I want to hear whatever's about to come here, because this is like the big existential questions, like why are we here? What's it all about anyway? Is to glorify God. The saying that is most often attributed to St. Irenaeus in the early years of the church, the glory of God is man fully alive. Of course, man was created in his image, but in his image we fell, and we oftentimes are not very glorifying of him. But the glory of God is man fully alive, body, soul, and spirit. The whole being that is a human being, fully alive, fully animated, gives great glory to God because it literally images him to the world. The model is an attempt, a schematic model. It's an attempt to paint a picture, as it were, of what a human being looks like when they're in a relatively balanced state of living. And that is in the face of the realities, the harshness of life, the surprises, the struggles, and everything else. But balanced not in terms of everything being in this perfectly static state, but rather in the fluidity of life, a conscious attention all of the time to the things of body, the things of soul, and the things of spirit. How do we live those out every day and thereby, in a fairly healthy, balanced state, moving toward balance rather than away from it, give our greatest glory to God as his image in this world? 3 points of the triangle. Top one is worship. Lower left is work. Lower right is play. The idea here is that we're going to look at the bulk of what we do in our conscious waking state in, say, a 24-hour period. We all get only 24 hours in a day. You can't add another minute to the day. It's a fixed amount. And about 8 hours of those 24 are going to go to sleep. We're not going to look at utilitarian kinds of things that absolutely have to be done. We're attending instead to the more consciously chosen action as you divide it out in about a 16 to 18 hour day. That's all the time you're going to get. How are you going to apportion your use of that time? So each of these three broad categories I'm suggesting can, as long as you define them relatively broadly, can hold the bulk of the chosen activity we engage in during the day. So for worship, let's start with that top one there, Kim. For worship, what we're talking about is the things that first come to mind, like being in church, morning devotions. Okay, that's a chosen conscious time. Prayer, well, that might be more throughout the day. Meditation time, okay, and listening to praise and worship, maybe that happens on the commute or listening to a sermon or something. Times of silence and solitude, okay, so you mean like when I just kind of shut out the world for a while, maybe go for a little sit out on the back deck or something, that might be a worship time. It's also going to be other consciously chosen activities like visiting shut-ins or volunteering for some kind of a church committee that you serve on, or people in the hospital. It's going to be other times that maybe you didn't plan them, but an opportunity presented itself. And if you will pause and intentionally engage yourself in that moment, it becomes a worshipful time. So you're out walking around nature and suddenly, boy, you're very aware of that warm sun on your face and the breeze that just struck you, and you hear the birds and you see the squirrel burying the nut, and you suddenly just put a hold on all the rest of life. Time's going to keep marching on, but you choose to pause and drink deeply from that awareness, not just of beauty, but of order and of God's fingerprints all over everything. And that becomes a worshipful time. Connection with His Holy Spirit, connection with the Father God Creator, thanks to Him through the Son for all that we're surrounded by. So these kinds of times, all of those consciously chosen activities, highly structured and not so structured, but all clearly conscious. Think about those activities and recognize that when you engage your being in a worshipful activity, it requires something of you. It requires your time. It's going to chew up some of that time, and it's going to require your attention. It may require your brain power if you're on a committee or something. It's going to require you not being distracted by other things. If you are in church and you're tithing, it's requiring your financial commitment. So it's requiring something of you. But worship not only glorifies the Father, it always pours back into us. There's a reciprocal relationship anytime we engage in worship, that as we lift our spirits through our intentional use of self and focus, God fills our spirits. Even if we're facing very difficult times, sometimes the very best thing you can do is spend some time just in worship and thanks and gratitude. So that reciprocity, that I'm going to intentionally pour out, give something, and it's going to fill me back, my spirit is going to be filled or nourished by God Himself during that worshipful activity.
Okay, so what I'm hearing then is at the top of the triangle, and I'm assuming you put it there because it is the critical, the most important. It's what we were made to do. We were made to worship. And when we do that, not only do we turn our attention to Him, but He just, as always, He's so lavish. He pours back into us and gives us abundantly above and beyond whatever we think we may have given to that.
Yes, yes, yes. In fact, if the model didn't have those other two pieces of the triangle, that base of work and play, you could say, well, hey, just everything is worship, right? You know, I mean, if the chief end of man is to glorify God, then it's all about worship. Well, yes, but the reality is that we have to work for a living. It's part of the fall, but there was work to do even before the fall in the garden. Man was put in charge of tending the garden. And so there's work, and work rightly engaged in, of course, is a very worshipful activity. But we're going to separate it out here on the lower left-hand side of the model to say, well, let's talk more specifically about the fact that the bulk of our hours most days are going to be chewed up in work activities. And that's the work that you do to pay your bills, to earn a living. It's also the work of maintaining a house, paying your bills, right? Lawn maintenance, housekeeping, preparing meals, buying groceries, all of those kinds of things, they require something of us. They require our time. They require our attention. They require our intentional focus. They require our money. And so we're giving out, but of course we get back. There is a reciprocity about that. Why do we work? To take care of the body. Food, clothing, and shelter. The basic needs in order to survive, and hopefully then to even have beyond that, those are what primarily come back to us by being industrious. Investing ourselves in the work that is before us and doing so as unto the Lord, it therefore becomes a worshipful activity. But even just looking at the activity itself as work, we're saying, yeah, the bulk of your time most days is going to be consumed with an awful lot of work activity, but that's okay. Because work is going to feed the body if it's fully engaged. And now, if you're piddling around with your work and you're not really investing, you're going to starve. You're going to have trouble keeping a roof over your head or whatever. But if you're investing, it's a reciprocal relationship, again, that takes care of the body. It demands of the body, it feeds back into the body. Worship demands of the Spirit, it pours back into the Spirit.
Yeah. And I know we're probably going to get back to this in a minute, but I just so I don't forget my question, it seems like this is the category that has a lot of bleed over, you know, into the play and into the worship. And you're talking about balance, and it's hard to keep this one in mentally, emotionally, you know, rein it in. But let me go ahead and ask you to finish with the play part of the model, and then you can perhaps teach us how to keep these all in their proper perspective and balance.
Well, I wish I could, but you put your finger on one of the challenges. Of course, any schematic model is going to break down at a certain point because you're trying to paint a static picture of something that is in fact fluid and always changing. So I've never lived this model of balance perfectly. I don't know how to ever live it, but it does give me a plumb line or a North Star. It's a gauge against which I am able to pause, if I will, at any point in my day and ask, well, okay, I'm feeling kind of out of balance right now. What area of my being, and therefore area of activity, do I need to perhaps give a little more attention to right now because I'm starving? I'm getting a little hungry in one of these areas, spirit or body, or let's get over to the third part there on the lower right-hand side of the model, the play portion. The way I've defined play is activity that is very intentionally engaged in. This is not vegging out. That's not play. Play is going to have the same kind of definition as the others. It's going to require something of us. And, thankfully, play, healthy play, is going to put something back. So play that is requiring something of us is something where you're choosing an activity that you really enjoy. The soulish part of you just gets fed when you're horseback riding or hiking or taking a stroll around the lake or playing with your grandchildren on the floor or doing a hobby that you just really enjoy. Not going to turn your hobby into a job. You're just doing the hobby for the sheer enjoyment of, say, painting or whatever it is, or playing an instrument. In order to do it well, it requires something. You might take lessons, might need to get a better instrument, might need to practice. It's intentional use of time and attention and money, but it's going to put back. What does it put back? It puts back a feeding of your soul. And soul and spirit are parts of self that, of course, you could spend a whole theology course on those. We're not going to parse all the finer points out, but I use a simple definition of the soulish part of ourselves as being our mind, our will, and our emotions. So if your mind and emotions are in a fairly good state, you're thinking on good things, and emotionally you've fed and taken care of things that will nourish and nurture, even just a good book, If your mind's been stimulated and your emotions are in a good state, your will is going to be easier to exercise control over. Because, come on, our spirit's willing, but our flesh is weak. It's that will part of us that says, well, I'm just tired. I'm crabby. I'm cranky. I didn't sleep well last night. So we have a hard time disciplining our soul, the soulish part that connects our body and our spirit. Well, when we play, when we nourish our soul, our will is easier to control, to bring under subjection to the desires of the spirit. So again, we're looking at all three parts of self: spirit with worship, body with work, and soul with play. We've broken out the human being into the three parts of self, body, soul, and spirit, and into the three primary activities that we principally choose during a day. Not utilitarian and not sleeping, but worship, work, and play. Each one, if engaged in consciously, and it's not a matter of how much time, like 6 hours of one, 6 hours of the other, and 6 hours of the third. No, it's not a time thing. The bulk of it's going to be work. But when we're working, we're really working. Well, hard, giving our best, and it's taking care of all of our financial needs and all of our body needs and our family's needs. And then when we're worshiping, we're really fully engaged in worship, not distracted thinking about the pressures back at the office, not dreaming about the football game. That would be play later on. No, we're worshiping then. And then when we get to play and we enjoy a football party or a pickup game of wiffle ball out in the backyard with the kids or whatever your play activity is, you're fully engaged in that. Each one of those things fully engaged in is going to fully feed back then your body or your soul or your spirit.
And I think this is the one that got me when I was a student in your first life coaching class, or was it your first class, my first life coaching class all those years ago. Because if I designed what I thought was an optimal model, it would have been a line with 2 points: worship and work. The fact that it had a triangle and there was a foundation, and play wasn't just something I should feel guilty about or something, that I don't know what I thought. I thought it was a frivolous thing, not an important part of feeding my soul. And so intentionally integrating play, I was very convicted that not only did I not do it, I hadn't even really consciously thought through the fact that that was a good thing to do.
Well, I'm glad that you said that. That's very vulnerable, and I think that you're speaking for a whole lot of listeners, and I know you're speaking for myself. So, of course, any good model better first land with self, and this one painfully did for me. So good for you for acknowledging, too, that, yeah, this hits us because I think that without a great deal of conscious intentionality, if we're not even Christians, probably we're not even a linear thing between work and worship. We're just working, and then, just kind of vegging out, shutting down, burning out, whatever. But when we become a Christian, we understand, oh, wait a minute, the chief end of man is to glorify God. Okay, so we need to have worship time. So we get very involved in worshipful activities and Bible study and such, and that's good. That's adding to the model. But somehow, and I think perhaps even particularly in many Christian circles, we devalue play, the value of feeding the soul. If you're going to learn an instrument, well, you better be sure you're using it for the praise band. Well, maybe. Maybe not. If you're going to play an instrument, you better make some money at it. If you're going to do this activity, then be sure that you're doing it as part of a missions outreach. No, play needs to have value in and of itself because you love it. You delight in it. It gives you joy just as creating gave the Father joy when he created everything and said, this is good. This is an outgrowth of the love that the Father had with the Son in the triune state before the world began. He not only created rest on the seventh day, I believe he created play, and I believe Jesus laughed a lot. I believe he knew what it was to be fully present in a delightful, soul-filling moment. And I believe that he had many of them with his disciples and with his childhood friends growing up, huh?
Oh, of course. He's the blessed God. And one of the definitions of blessed is happy. He's the deeply happy God. And he's inviting us into his joy and his satisfaction and his happiness. But I'm just going to back to being honest with you. This was tough for me. So many of my very first peer coaching sessions were, what does play even look like for Kim Avery? If Kim Avery ever played, what would she do? Now, you wouldn't recognize me today. You'll be glad to know I've improved. It's like, okay, Kim, stop playing. It's time to get to work. But it is such an important thing. And so I know your model also speaks to at least the typical Western mindset of what happens when we get out of balance. And I love the way you kind of put words around that. So would you share those with our listeners?
I think because of the conversation that Kim and I are both honestly having here about the difficulties sometimes of embracing play and the tendency that we have to become kind of human doings instead of human beings, right? Just work, doing all the time. Or if we're going to worship, well, we're doing there, and we're burning out for Jesus, as they say. We're just kind of overworking in the ministry of the church, devaluing play. So you're going to start with the word worship up there at the top of your triangle, and where the W is, the beginning of the word worship, you're going to begin your arrow, and you're going to arc it down toward the word work, and your arrow points to the word work. So you've drawn an arrow from worship to work, and that's to demonstrate that oftentimes we worship our work. Now hold that thought, because you're going to go from the word work, and you're going to arc another arrow now at the bottom of your thing over to the word play, and you're drawing your arrow toward the word play. And that's to demonstrate that oftentimes we work hard at allowing ourselves to play, at even convincing ourselves that anything could be valuable if it's play. So we work at play. We worship our work. We work at play, and you got it now. There's a third arc that's going to come from the word play up there all the way pointing to the word worship. We oftentimes play around with our worship. Don't really give it our full attention, don't really take it very seriously, don't really dig down very deeply. And so if that's a picture of how, as Kim, you're saying, often in Western culture, we tend to live, where we're worshiping work, and by that I don't mean that we intentionally made it an idol, but it gets the bulk of not only our time, it gets the bulk of our attention. And like real worship is supposed to, instead if we're worshiping our work, it's where we get our greatest sense of self-worth, value, identity. We're supposed to get that from the Lord. Our worth, our value, our identity is to come from Him in state before Him in worship. But instead we look to see what titles and what paycheck and what car and whatever else. We're worshiping our work. It's becoming an idol for us. It is what we're sacrificing the best of everything that we have to. And we're helping to raise up some corporate entity or some ministry that we belong to or whatever. But if that is our work and we are worshiping it, we are out of balance there. That will consume the bulk of our time and attention. And then especially if we are working at our play, we're really saying it's hard for me to even give myself permission to play. I'm not really sure theologically where play falls in God's hierarchy. But if you're saying it's on there, I'm going to have to think about that a while because I'm not sure. It's hard for me to give myself permission to just enjoy an afternoon away from the office. Do you know all the things that are screaming for my attention? Well, yeah, I probably do, because they're probably like the things that are calling for my attention. Work will expand to fill the time available for its completion. There's never enough time to do all the work. But play doesn't have that same urgency on the practical body side. It does on the soulish part of ourselves. And we all know when we're getting really crispy around the edges emotionally, mentally, dull. I'm still at work, but boy, I've reached the point of diminishing returns. I am not getting much work out of it. I'm just still answering emails. But I'm worshiping my work. It's work for me to play. And so I'm not getting my soul fed. And then, to complete our arc here, if we're playing around at our worship, then it's an afterthought. It's I'll listen to a praise tape on the way to work. Or, I pray while I'm in the car. Hey, nothing wrong with praying in the car. But if that's the only time you're worshiping, you are a highly distracted driver, or else you're a highly distracted worshiper. You're not able to do either one well if that's the only time that you're principally focusing on the Lord. Those times of retreat, private meditation, journaling, reflection, getting out into nature, basking in worship music, times of fasting and earnest digging in for whatever the Lord may be calling you to, for discerning. Those times are going to feed your spirit like nothing else can. But if you're playing around with them, there won't really ever be much time for them and not much attention given to them. And guess what? Your spirit's going to be starving. So if our soul is starving, getting crispy and burnt out, if our spirit is starving, what are we basically doing? We're just working. We expanded our model to include the other two parts, but we're really only focusing on work still and yet, even as Christians.
Yeah. And you're saying so many good words, and I couldn't capture them all, and I'll probably end up putting some of them in my own words because of that. But it sounds like when we do that, when we worship our work and we work at our play and we play at our worship, we're empty, we're dull, we're stressed, we're driven, we're distracted, we're tired, and we're crispy around the edges. Which means to me, when we're living the more fully alive, balanced model that you're talking about, we know who we are and our identity in Christ. We're very self-aware. We're contributing. We're creative. We're peaceful, relaxed, playful, which means we're humble, fully present, in love with our God and in love with the life He's given us. And what a stark contrast between those two ways that model can work.
Well, and thanks for saying it. You actually caught my words and the spirit of what I was saying very well and probably much more succinctly. I do believe that in Western culture, Christians as well as non-Christians, and Christians perhaps even more than other persons perhaps, tend toward a great imbalance in this model. Worshiping our work, working at play, playing at our worship, everything feeling out of kilter. And so it does mean that mostly we're just work. And there's one more piece of this model. So those of you that have it in front of you, if you want to go to the center of your triangle, just kind of that space that is called your life. And we're going to actually give you an escape hatch here. We're going to have you draw, if that's the beginning point of your arrow, you're going to draw an arc arrow out to the right-hand side of your page, kind of just out into space, out into nothingness. And it's going to point to a single word that floats out there, and that word is escape. From the center of a life, if it is out of balance in all three ways, worshiping work, working at play, playing at worship, basically we just live a life that is work. I can't work anymore. I'm burnt. I'm burning out. Again, I got to escape. And we just kind of check out on life, relationships, anything that could possibly really feed the soul or feed the spirit. We instead numb them. We deaden them. We call those things addictions. Escapism, vegging out, it doesn't have to be drugs or alcohol. It is anything that allows you to just numb because you're so exhausted in body now and in soul and in spirit. Because everything's out of kilter, you just got to not feel anything. And so for some people, it's recreational shopping. And they know that they don't need anything, and this isn't about just enjoying an evening out with the girls. This is about medicating self. For other people, it's eating. For other people, it's surfing the web. For other people, it's a far less healthy addiction. For other people, it's sports. And hey, nothing wrong with spectator sports in proper measure. But spectator sports can be play if it's soul-feeding, or it can be escape if it's self-medicating. And persons know that. Kim, I found over and over, when I explain the model, people know immediately to what degree the activity they're engaging in categorizes as real play or real worship or real work, or instead is, actually, I'm just using that to escape.
Sure. And it seems like some of the distinction is really around the intentionality of it. Like you said, even play takes pouring into it, takes an investment of self. Such an interesting word we have in our culture called amusement, like amusement parks. Well, muse means to think. So for without amusement, we're doing things without thinking, without intentionality. And some of that can be play, but a lot of it is just that plain old escape. And I do believe, back to my kind of eye-opening moment when you first presented this model, I thought TV watching in the evening after a really long, hard day's work was play. And it wasn't giving me life. Even though I was vegging out and my amusement, I was drained at the end of the evening. It wasn't pouring back into me because I wasn't investing any of myself in the effort. And that's one of the beautiful things I think you taught me through this model, Chris. So just a big thank you for that.
Boy, I'll tell you what, I'm really glad you pointed it out, though, because everybody can identify with that. Whatever our escape is, not only does it not require anything of us, but because it isn't requiring anything, it's not putting anything back either. The biggest challenge for most people when I teach on it, of course, are worship and play. And that's where the real coaching comes in. Well, so what for you are your deepest experiences of worship where you know you're investing and you know your spirit is receiving, strengthening and renewing of your spirit, clarifying of your vision for what God's called you to and what's next and what's worthy of investing yourself in? What for you is play? What really nourishes your soul? If you didn't have to worry about whether or not it was a wise use of your money, why are you going to waste money on that? Hey, time you enjoy wasting is not time wasted. You enjoyed it. It filled your soul. What is that for you? How could you begin to intentionally orient your life and your time, your decision-making to allow for more of that?
Yeah. And so before we start to wrap up, and we do have an action step people can take today to move closer to this more balanced view of life. Just a personal question, Chris. What has it done for you to acknowledge and live out of these 3 areas of life balance versus just 1 or 2 of them?
Well, I certainly believe that I am healthier than I would be, but I have no picture of health. I think anyone who tries to put themselves out as if they were is probably also going to try to sell you snake oil or something. So what I have found is that not only in my own life now as an adult and raising our own children, do I find that consciously stopping myself frequently and filtering what I'm doing in a given day through this model allows me to make better choices about whether to continue working or maybe it's time to stop now. And what would be better for me now, a worship activity or a play activity to feed my spirit or to feed my soul? But I look back at the childhood that I came from. Kim, you interviewed me on here not long ago about the family that I grew up in, a very strong, intact Christian family. And one of the phrases that my mother raised we kids with was actually, and originally it's a piece of poetry, which is longer, and I'll not recite the entire piece here. But the butchered piece of it that she raised us with was simply this: if I had but 2 pence, with one I would buy bread, and with the other I would buy hyacinth, for they would feed my soul. So Mom, in her little country girl wisdom that she grew up with out here in the farm, hyacinth, of course, a beautiful flower, comes around in February and March, some of the first of after the snows are coming off, beautifully fragrant and many different colors. So we always buy hyacinth here, but it's not the literal translation of the poem that is the point. It is that anything that you recognize feeds your soul needs its place in your life roughly equal to whatever would feed your body. With 1 pence, I would buy bread. That's going to feed my body. With the other, I would buy hyacinth, for they would feed my soul. When we moved out here to the country, Kim, we bought a couple of horses, and that was probably the last thing that anybody would have said we had any business doing when money was very tight and we were trying to build the business. But we had young kids. We were in the country, and by golly, we wanted some horses. And so my mare that I bought was named Hyacinth, because that money and that time and intentionality spent with her and doing the horseback riding on all these hillsides here fed our souls like nothing else. It has great value. I believe my ability to grow that practice was greatly increased when I was working because of the soul feeding there. And so in that sense, I think it's true for all of us. Any degree to which we attend more consciously and intentionally to the feeding of the spirit and the feeding of our soul, we will reap benefits on all three parts of our being, and we will find ourselves in greater balance with a less felt need to escape. What do I need to escape from if I'm in pretty good shape, body, soul, and spirit? I don't. The chief end of man is glorifying God. I'm enjoying living this life he's given me with all of its shortcomings and struggles and receiving great joy from that.